The show you're about to listen to may contain themes of violence, occult activities, strong language, and other sensitive material. With an emphasis on cults, murder, and other adult matters, listener discretion is advised. On Cult Leader, I strive for telling stories in a truthful manner, though press, media, and other resources cannot always be verified. Sources can be found in the show notes. Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your Cult Leader, Spencer Henry, and in a recent Little Leader, I mentioned a case from 1991 that had everybody in Austin, Texas on edge. Understandably so. It was a nightmare situation. You have 4 teenage girls brutally murdered and not a suspect in sight. It would take a long time to find that suspect, and it's a case that could have been entirely avoided, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, the city of Austin itself in 1991 was not the Austin, Texas we know today. There wasn't Kendra Scott stores and stark white coffee shops with pink cowboy hats on the wall. Local mom and pop shops took precedence, and it had that cozy feeling that a lot of cities in America had at the time, only to be quite frankly shattered by the 2010s. And sorry, I take it personally, okay? I experienced it myself. Small business owners having to shut their doors for these evil corporations, these evil corporate landlords coming in and swooping up real estate. Sure, you can stay, but your rent is now 4 times what it used to be. One of my best friends moved to Austin when we were 18, around 18, I should say. And when I visited, it still had very good, cozy vibes. And don't get me wrong, I still love Austin, but I recall when Madison and I toured there for both our live show and a year later for our book tour, it was different. The city felt different. You could see that there were a lot of changes that had been made, and I still think it's a great city, but it's kind of like Nashville in the sense where you have cute little neighborhood areas where there's colorful mom and pop shops, coffee shops with mismatched furniture, and restaurants that have been around for 30 plus years. And then you have areas like 12 South here that are sort of mini LAs with trendy restaurants, upscale retail stores, and it happened everywhere. We saw this. It was a widespread event. My own hometown was a quaint suburb with a cute little downtown, and it ended up becoming filled with corporations and luxury retail shopping. And I do remember growing up, we had the cutest little frozen yogurt shop. It was in this curvy brick building. There was ivy dripping down from the sides, and we frequented before it started losing business to what I can only refer to as the frozen yogurt craze of the 2010s. Remember, all of a sudden, Pinkberry, Yogurtland, they were popping up everywhere, and they were like Hollywood hotspots. We were seeing paparazzi photos in magazines of your favorite celebrity filling up their little frozen yogurt cup. And today's story centers around a frozen yogurt shop, just like the one I grew up with. This one was called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, and it sat inside of a strip mall at 2949 West Anderson Lane in Austin, Texas. Just like my yogurt shop. It served as a first job for teenagers in the area, a meetup for kids, a wholesome place, one of the last places you'd expect to become a brutal crime scene. This shop itself was simple. Customers walked through a glass storefront to a front counter where their orders were taken. A few booths and tables filled the dining area, and behind the counter was a small workspace where employees mixed toppings, stored ingredients, washed dishes, and just handled the nightly closing routine. All that working at a frozen yogurt shop entails. Teen employees often closed down the store themselves. After the last customers left, they cleaned tables, they swept the floors, counted the register, and locked up before heading home. On Friday evening, December 6, 1991, 2 of those teenage employees were working the closing shift. 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, also 17 years old. Both girls were your typical high school seniors, balancing school, activities, and part-time work, learning that good old-fashioned responsibility. Now, Jennifer was known as responsible and dependable, exactly the kind of employee a manager trusted with closing duties. Eliza had been working at the yogurt shop as well, and she spent much of her time outside of work involved with agricultural programs through school. They did FFA, the Future Farmers of America, raising animals, participating in livestock competitions. It was something she took seriously, and she had a lot of pride in this. These were responsible, wholesome girls. It's a Friday night, right? Their friends are coming by. Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah Harbison, who was 15 at the time, stopped by the shop with their close friend, Amy Ayers, who was 13 years old. Sarah and Amy had come to meet Jennifer and Eliza so that they could all head home together once the store closed. This wasn't a rare occurrence whatsoever. They got there a little early. The girls spent the evening inside of the yogurt shop, finishing the last task of the night. Wiping down the tables, cleaning up all the frozen yogurt spillage, picking up the sprinkles, and just preparing the store for closing. Outside of the building, Anderson Lane traffic got quieter as the hour grew later and most nearby businesses had already shut down for the night. At some point during the closing process, an unknown perpetrator, or more likely perpetrators, entered the frozen yogurt shop. And what happened next, we'll probably never know. It would be picked apart and pieced together by detectives and the public alike over and over and over again. Here's what we think happened, or what investigators believe happened. They determined that the girls had been overpowered and restrained with their own clothing, specifically underwear that was used to bind their hands and gag them. The attacker or attackers forced the girls toward the back area of the shop, away from the windows and the front counter, where nobody could see them. Evidence recovered later on would also indicate that at least one of the victims had been sexually assaulted during the attack, though this is something that the authorities kept close to their chest until they were forced to publicly reveal it. One by one, these teenage girls were killed. Each was shot execution style in the back of the head at close range. Very similar. However, one of the girls, 13-year-old Amy, she's a little bit of a different story. She too had been shot, but the bullet had missed her brain, and then she had been shot a second time. That bullet did in fact cause severe brain damage. She was found in a separate part of the shop, which led authorities to believe that she may have survived the initial gunshots and attempted to crawl out. But unfortunately, she didn't make it out. And when her body was discovered, she was covered in what they referred to as early third-degree burns on over 30% of her body. These burns were a result of the perpetrator or perpetrators attempting to cover up a crime scene, destroy evidence. They had set the yogurt shop on fire. Flames quickly spread through the dining area and back workspace, charring the walls and furniture and filling the building with this billowing black smoke. It was in the early morning hours of December 7th, 1991 that the call came in, not to the authorities but to firefighters, who responded quickly to a call about the yogurt shop. What initially appeared to be a routine commercial fire quickly turned into something far more disturbing. This wasn't an electrical fire, this was something much more sinister. Once the flames were under control, firefighters were able to enter the building. The interior of the store had been completely blackened by flames, soaked by the water used to knock down the fire. Tables were overturned, booth cushions burned and scattered across the floor. Debris littered the small dining area and the back portion of the shop where employees normally prepared orders and closed down the register for the night. It was a total mess. And it was back there that they made a grim discovery: the bodies of 4 teenage girls. But even with the damage to the scene, the state of the bodies, the smoke, the burns, they could tell the girls hadn't died from the fire itself. This wasn't a simple death by smoke inhalation. Each of the victims had gunshot wounds to their heads. The fire had come afterward. Within hours, the shopping center on Anderson Lane was sealed off with police tape. Patrol cars blocked the entrances while detectives, crime scene technicians, and investigators moved methodically throughout this burned building, documenting whatever was left at the scene. As investigators began processing everything, they discovered another crucial detail. Ballistics evidence showed that 2 different firearms had been used during the killings. Recovered shell casings and bullet fragments indicated the presence of both a .22 caliber weapon and a .38 caliber handgun. Investigators believed that this was a telltale sign that the heinous act was committed by multiple suspects. Is it a guarantee? No. As we know, gunmen can have multiple weapons in their arsenal. We see shootings every day here. But their instincts were telling them pretty early on that this was the work of multiple perpetrators. 4 murder victims. It was hard to believe that this could all be the work of one man. Still, it was hard to be certain. The fire had destroyed or contaminated so much of the forensic evidence inside the store. Smoke, heat, water from the fire hoses had compromised fingerprints and other trace evidence that might have identified the attackers. Even basic reconstructions of the sequence of events was made more difficult by the damage. It was exactly what the killer or killers wanted. This is what they intended, right? They wanted to cover up the crime scene. And not only had they been able to cover it up, but they got the bonus that came with putting out the fires. Detectives collected everything they could, from the bullet fragments and the shell casings to burned articles of clothing and any physical evidence that might survive laboratory analysis. But we also have to remember, as nostalgic as we can be for the 90s, this was a different time, right? Forensics were not as advanced as they are now. As you can imagine, news of the crime spread quickly across Austin on local radio and television broadcasts. 4 teenage girls brutally murdered. It's everyone's nightmare. By the next morning, the story was on the front page of newspapers across Texas. Parents across the city woke up to the horrifying news that these 4 beautiful teenage girls had been murdered inside of their neighborhood yogurt shop. The brutality of the killings, the young age of the victims, and the seemingly random location of the attack left the community stunned. For many residents, it was impossible to imagine. Classmates were shocked. Ryan Howard, a friend of the girls from Lanier High School, later stated, all of them had, pretty strong, spunky personalities. We're kind of, country strong, so to speak. Never afraid to speak their mind or give you some good advice, Howard said. Authorities were tasked with the impossible. Truly. How do you nail down a suspect like this? The investigation involved the Austin Police Department, along with assistance from the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the Texas Department of Public Safety. That tells you how perplexing this case was. We've talked about this with other notorious crimes of the past. They're calling in everyone, right? And I actually found an official letter from the Austin Police Department requesting help from the Bureau a few weeks after the murder, and that was found on the FBI's website in their archives. This was marked on January 13th, 1992, so a little over a month after the murders, and it reads as follows. The subject line on it said, quote, Re Austin Police Department case number 91-340-2046. Titled Capital Murder. The agent's name was redacted, to whom this letter was addressed to, but inside this said, quote, please consider this letter the formal request of the Austin Police Department to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for assistance in the investigation of the quadruple murder occurring December 6, 1991 in Austin, Travis County, Texas. The assistance of the Bureau is needed in the area of personality profiles of the offenders in the case. All investigative material will be made available to your agency as soon as practical. As case agent, I stand ready to make any materials or personnel available to the Bureau on a moment's notice. On behalf of the homicide investigators of the Austin Police Department, may I say that we greatly appreciate the Bureau's assistance in this investigation. So basically, the police department, this is them reaching out to the FBI because they have no idea what type of suspect they're looking for. Again, there wasn't a lot of forensic evidence left behind. They're not sure what to do. Detectives did indeed begin canvassing the area surrounding the shopping center, knocking on doors, interviewing anyone who might have seen something suspicious the night of the murders. Meanwhile, the task force started piecing together a profile on the suspect with the help of the FBI. What would somebody who committed a crime like this look like? What was their life like? And this was something that I found really interesting because the FBI basically came up with a profile for who they thought this murder suspect would be. This again comes from the FBI's official archives, and it says, quote, although the race of the offenders in this case is difficult to determine, it is probable that the killers are white, although other races cannot be eliminated on this basis alone due to the fact that other races frequent this commercialized area. The age of the offenders is difficult to establish, but in all probability, they are in their late teens to mid-20s. If they are older, they will still function socially and emotionally within this age range. The offender would have consumed alcohol and or drugs prior to the offense and would have continued their use afterwards. Again, there was no evidence of drugs found in the crime scene. This is just their idea of who a perfect suspect for this crime would be, or suspects rather. It is doubtful that the offender completed high school, and he would have been considered an underachiever with less than average grades. He would have been a major discipline problem for school officials as well as his parents. This is also basically just a profile of me as a teenager. The offender definitely resents any form of discipline, i.e. parents, school, employment, police, etc., etc. This offender has an explosive personality and angers easily, especially when drinking alcohol and or using drugs. He is an impulsive person who acts without considering the consequences of his acts. Any physical confrontations he may become involved in will only occur when he is in a sure win situation, such as having the advantage over someone with less strength. It's just so interesting to me that this is the profile they came up with, which we'll come back to later on, but it's fascinating to me because I'm like, were they talking to other criminals who were similar offenders and getting their MO? You know, like, what are they basing this all on then? It went on to say, before any confrontation with any male adult, he must have the security of having his friends present. This offender, in all probability, is unemployed, or if employed, will be in a menial type employment not requiring contact with the public. This offender will have a history of frequently changing jobs, and his work records will reflect that he is less than a dependable employee with higher ups. It profiles their living situation, saying this offender will live in some sort of dependent relationship with an older person, possibly a parent, whom he is partially financially dependent. This offender frequents the area of the yogurt shop and is familiar with the roadways and stores in the vicinity. The offender's personal appearance will be in accord with his peer group, but will appear thuggy to the conservative element of the community. He has little pride in his personal appearance, such as his hair, clothing, etc. In other words, he presents himself to be what he is. A thug. I also love that this is kind of like dragging the person a little bit. This offender, in all likelihood, has a past criminal history. This offender is a very unpredictable, impulsive type of individual who will act without considering the consequences. He will be abusive in any relationships he may have with females, and he will probably seek out females who are younger and less adequate than himself. In all probability, the offender is a resident of the area. This offender has no remorse or concern that he has killed the victims. He is under a tremendous amount of stress from fear of detection and apprehension because the commission of this crime may not have gone as planned. The offender is very concerned about the loyalty of his accomplices because he knows they regret their involvement in this crime. In cases such as this, in which there are multiple offenders, many times disharmony will develop between the offenders as their stress level rises along with their increased paranoia, causing them to doubt each other's loyalty. So they are inferring in this that there is accomplices. Because of their paranoia, they will maintain close contact with each other for a period of time, even though at some point there may be a falling out between the offenders that could lead to violence. Immediately after leaving the scene, the offenders would have gone to a secure location to clean up or change clothes, even though the crime scene does not indicate that they would have a lot of blood on them. There is a possibility that the offenders returned to the area the same night to observe the police and fire department personnel at the scene. Once again, they go on to drag their suspect. It is doubtful the offenders are employed, but if so, they would not have worked the following day or possibly several days afterwards, even if they were scheduled to do so. If they did go to work afterwards, it would have been to avoid community suspicion of their involvement in this crime. To escape the tremendous stress of the situation, the offenders may have temporarily left town and would have given reasons to those who know them that would appear to be legitimate. So that's the profile that they've pieced together. Based on the information that they were able to gather from the crime scene, the type of crime that was committed, the method, the manner, all of it, this is what the FBI comes up with and presents to the investigators on the case. They have their profile. This is the suspect or suspects, whoever they're running with, whether it's one guy acting alone or multiple suspects. Here you go. It's time to continue the hunt. So employees from nearby businesses, residents from surrounding apartment complexes, motorists who had passed through the area, all of them are questioned, right? Do you have any tips? Is there anything you saw that night that you can remember? Again, they have nothing to go off of other than this profile. One early witness did report seeing a man sit in a car outside of the yogurt shop around the time of the murders. The vehicle was described as an older white four-door sedan, possibly a Chevrolet Impala. Investigators took the description seriously. They began searching for anyone in the area who had a similar car, whether it was the exact one or something that just even loosely matched the description. They're grasping here. With the crime scene so badly damaged by the fire, investigators were forced to rely heavily on interviews, witness statements, and information that was coming in from the public at the time. As word of the investigation spread, tips did in fact begin pouring in, and having that profile made it a little easier to kind of knock certain ones out of the way. Detectives eventually received thousands of calls from the public. Each one logged and investigated in hopes that it might lead to the killers. Leads came in from Austin and from across Texas as people called in with suspicions, sightings, or rumors that they thought might be connected to the crime. And every tip had to be checked because somewhere in that flood of information, investigators hoped that there might be a clue that would lead them to whoever had walked into the yogurt shop on the night of December 6th, 1991. One of the earliest people that was questioned was this man named Maurice Pierce, who had been arrested not long after the murders at a nearby mall while carrying a .22 caliber pistol. Yep, one of the same types of weapons that investigators believed had been used during the killings inside of the yogurt shop. That fact immediately set off detectives' alarms. When they realized a local teenager had been picked up nearby with the same exact type of gun, they wanted to know what he knew. This Pierce kid told investigators that he had heard about the murders and claimed he had information about who might have been responsible. During questioning, he provided the names of several different acquaintances that he suggested may have been involved in the crime. And among the people that he mentioned were Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, not that one, and Forrest Wellborn. These were young mall rat outcasts with less than stellar reputations. Let's just say that. All right. A woman that was interviewed in an HBO documentary described Springsteen as looking like the kind of guy who would show you his dick in a parking lot. Okay, that's who we're dealing with here. But again, are these teenage mall rats responsible for this horrific quadruple murder? Detectives were able to track them down and they questioned them as well. But at the time, the investigation didn't produce any physical evidence tying any of those guys to the yogurt shop murders. None of the guys provided statements that placed themselves at the scene, and investigators were unable to corroborate Pierce's claims through any other potential witness, through any of the tips that came in, or any forensic evidence. They even tried the old wire trick. They made him wear a wire to try and get a confession on tape, but nothing. Just denials all around. Through and through. Nothing that was said during the monitored conversation clearly placed any of those guys inside of the yogurt shop that night. Instead of confirming Pierce's accusations, the discussion raised more doubts about whether his claims were credible. With little to support the accusations, the lead stalls. Okay? It's looking like we're headed towards a cold case. But in 1992, the investigation suddenly seemed to catch a big break. Authorities in Mexico announced that they had arrested several men they believed might be connected to the murders. And among the men taken into custody were Porfirio Villa Saavedra, Alberto Jimenez Cortez, and possibly a third accomplice whose name came up during their investigation. And at first, it seemed like, okay, shit, finally we've got some traction here, right? It sounded like the case might finally be cracking open. Mexican authorities said that Saavedra had confessed. According to investigators, he told them that he and others had in fact gone into that Austin yogurt shop the night of the murders. In his statement, Saavedra claimed that he raped one of the girls. He helped kill them inside the store before the place was set on fire. And here we go. This is it, right? We might actually have our guys. For detectives in Austin and for a public that had been desperate for answers, I mean, imagine your family member, your daughter, your child, your sister, your sibling, your classmate is brutally murdered. What solace that would give you. It seemed like it was going to be a huge development, but almost as quickly as this breakthrough appeared, it started falling apart. Not long after giving that confession, Saavedra completely changed his story in court in Mexico. He said the confession wasn't real at all. In fact, according to him, investigators had forced it out of him. He told the court that officers had put a plastic bag over his head while questioning him, basically suffocating him until he agreed to say whatever they wanted. A forced confession. He said they threatened his family if he didn't cooperate. Officials involved in the interrogation denied any sort of torture had taken place. They insisted the confession had been completely voluntary. But even setting that aside, okay, investigators started noticing problems with the story itself. Some of the things that Saavedra had described didn't actually line up with what detectives knew about the crime scene. Certain details were wrong, while others were things that had already been reported publicly in the news. Easy to find information. Yes, we didn't have this prominent Google search engine at the time, but you could still track down information. It started to look like Saavedra's confession might have been based on information that anyone following the case in any capacity whatsoever could have heard. And again, this was a big deal at the time. It was everywhere. And there's the fact that there was no physical evidence connecting Saavedra or the others to the yogurt shop. No fingerprints, no witnesses placing them there. Nothing tying them directly to the crime itself. And without that kind of evidence to back it up, his confession alone wasn't enough. Little by little, the entire lead collapsed. At the same time, police were exploring another possible connection that might explain what had happened inside of the yogurt shop. Investigators had started looking closely at another violent crime that had taken place in Austin just a few weeks earlier. On November 17th of 1991, this woman leaving a nightclub called the Cavity Club had accepted a ride home from three men, and she thought, okay, they're giving me a ride home. Nice guys. Instead, the men abducted her. They drove her out of Austin towards San Antonio, Texas, and started sexually assaulting her at gunpoint before eventually letting her go. The crime had obvious similarities that caught investigators' attention. It involved multiple attackers, a gun, a sexual assault. It happened in the same part of the city only weeks before the yogurt shop murders. Police created and released sketches of the three suspects in the kidnapping case. When investigators compared those sketches to witness statements from the yogurt shop investigation, something started to stand out. One of the drawings looked very similar to the description of a man who had reportedly been sitting in a car outside the yogurt shop around the time of the murders. Remember, that was one of the first tips that was called in, and that puts pressure on that tip, right? Detectives take a serious look at the possibility that the two crimes were connected. And for a while, investigators pursued the theory that the same group of men might have been responsible for both attacks. But as they dug deeper, the connections started to fall apart. Detectives were never able to find any solid evidence tying those suspects to the murders at the yogurt shop. And once again, this lead, this tip that had come in, it looked so promising, and it went nowhere. Meanwhile, the investigation itself was growing larger and more complicated by the day. There was a lot of pressure here. The case was gathering an enormous amount of attention. The tips were pouring in from everywhere, and detectives began compiling a list of potential suspects that eventually grew into the hundreds. This was going to take some time. And over time, investigators would look at more than 300 different people in connection with the case, chasing leads not just in Austin, but across Texas and several other surrounding states. The stranger the case became, the stranger some of the leads got. And at times, people actually claimed responsibility for the murders. Investigators later said that at least 6 different people submitted written confessions, each insisting that they had committed the crime. It's really got to make you question humanity. Right? Who on earth would do something like that? You have to be fucking just sick in the head. When the detectives checked those stories against the evidence, they fell apart. The details didn't match the crime scene, timelines didn't add up, and the people confessing often had no real connection to the case whatsoever. It was just simply batshit crazy people saying, yeah, I did it. Yeah, I did it. They wanted the notoriety. They saw maybe how big this case was and thought, hey, I want to be attached to that for whatever reason. They just wanted attention. As the investigation continued to drag on, the leads began getting even stranger. Rumors started circulating around Austin that the killings might have been connected to some kind of satanic cult activity. I mean, remember, this is the early 90s, cult babes, 91. We're just out of the 80s. We're in the middle of the satanic panic era, where communities across the country were convinced that underground cults and cabals were operating everywhere, from daycares to high schools to small town churches. No, it was happening on islands elsewhere with our top politicians, actually. The yogurt shop murders were so brutal and so hard to explain that people started looking for explanations anywhere that they could find them. Literally scraping for clues. Detectives began receiving tips from callers who claimed they had overheard teenagers talking about ritual killings. Others said they had heard rumors about strange groups gathering late at night in wooded areas around the city. Some people even claimed to see these for themselves. They're like, I've seen a satanic ritual or two in my life. Oh yeah, I saw this odd gathering outside of town. It was in a secluded spot where no one normally would be after dark. Investigators couldn't, of course, ignore those calls, right? They still need to look into them. They're tips. They could offer some valuable information. God forbid they're true. Even if these stories sounded far-fetched, every tip had to be checked. Probably didn't help that people were doing the daytime TV circuit at that point, talking about satanic ritual abuse that they had allegedly been involved in as children. So detectives did follow up. They interviewed people who made the claims. They looked into the rumors. They checked these secret, secluded, wooded locations where people were allegedly having these satanic cult meetups. But in the end, of course, nothing backed it up. All that ended up in evidence was a fake skull that was used as decoration. It belonged to the lady, actually, who said that Springsteen looked creepy. You gotta watch the docuseries. Again, it's on HBO, the Austin Yogurt Shop Murders. But there was no evidence of ritual activity at the crime scene, okay? There was no symbols, no patterns, nothing that suggested the murders had anything to do with cults or occult practices. Once investigators dug into it and realized that that skull was plastic, the entire theory turned out to be just that. Fake. Inauthentic. Rumors that were fueled by fear and speculation. And there were other strange tips too. Some callers pointed investigators toward groups of transient people rumored to be living along the creeks and wooded areas of North Austin, particularly around Shoal Creek. Locals sometimes refer to them as creek people. And these creek people, I mean, they were pretty much just runaways, a lot of them. Other types of people who camped and hung out near the water and occasionally would wander into the nearby shopping centers, but nothing to suggest that any of them were homicidal maniacs. People living in the area reported seeing them moving through the woods or hanging around parking lots at night, which led some residents to wonder if someone from those camps might have been involved in the yogurt shop murders. So police followed up on those tips as well. Detectives interviewed people who had been staying near the creek beds and searched the areas where the camps were located, but again, nothing. No evidence connecting anyone from those camps to the yogurt shop. No witnesses placing them near the store the night of the murders. Just yet another lead that went nowhere. And unfortunately, as is often the case, the investigation drags on for years. Leads dried up. Evidence went nowhere. What had once been the most important investigation in Austin was becoming what every detective dreads: a cold case. Nearly a decade had passed without answers. The families, they're still waiting. Not a day goes by that they're not hoping for closure. The investigators who had worked the case from the beginning were still carrying it with them. And then in 1999, 8 years later, the case suddenly takes a turn. A new group of detectives inside the Austin Police Department's cold case unit began digging back into the investigation. They reopened the old files. They combed through witness statements and started re-interviewing people who had been questioned during the initial investigation back in 91. In that process, this re-combing through led them back to a group of names that had surfaced almost immediately after the murders. Remember Maurice Pierce, the guy who was arrested after the killings while carrying a .22 caliber pistol? When detectives revisited the early reports, they saw that Pierce had once pointed investigators towards several acquaintances. Right? We had Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn. All 4 of the men had been teenagers at the time of the murders. All 4 had been questioned back in 1991. And back then, nothing had come of it. But now, nearly 8 years later, detectives decided to take another run at it. And police brought the men in again for questioning. During a series of interrogations in 1999, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott eventually gave statements admitting involvement in the murders. It was a breakthrough. Investigators said the confessions contained details about the crime that had never been publicly released. For prosecutors, that became the backbone of the case. But the story didn't stay that simple for long. Not long after giving those statements, both men recanted, saying the confessions had been the product of marathon interrogations that stretched for hours. According to them, investigators repeatedly confronted them with theories about how the crime happened, pushing them to agree until they eventually signed statements just to end the questioning. Despite those claims, despite saying they recanted their stories, the prosecutors moved forward. And as the case moved toward trial, the evidence was still paper thin. So thin that Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn were eventually cleared altogether, with prosecutors admitting they didn't have enough evidence to move forward against them. But the case against Springsteen and Scott, it went ahead. When the trials began, the prosecution's case obviously leaned heavily on the confession statements that were obtained during the police interrogations. In fact, the confessions were pretty much the entire case. It was all they had. There was no physical evidence tying either man to the yogurt shop. Prosecutors argued that the confessions told the story of what had happened inside the yogurt shop that night. It didn't matter whether they had any physical evidence because the juries believed them. People wanted to see conclusion here. They wanted justice for these 4 young women. In 2001, a jury convicted Robert Springsteen of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. The following year, in 2002, Michael Scott was tried separately and convicted as well. He received a life sentence. For many people in Austin, the verdicts felt like the end of a decade-long nightmare. It had been nearly 10 years since the murders, and the case had haunted the city the entire time. With the convictions, it seemed like the mystery had finally been solved, but the story wasn't finished. Over the next several years, defense attorneys kept challenging the convictions through appeals. A major focus of those appeals centered on the interrogations themselves. We're talking how long they lasted, what investigators told the suspects during questioning, and whether the confessions could really be considered reliable. Memory experts and other experts weighed in and agreed that the interrogations were, well, sketchy. I mean, they did all the sketchiest interrogation tactics possible. But something else was changing around this time, too. Forensic science, baby. By the late 2000s, new DNA testing methods were allowing investigators to re-examine biological evidence that was collected years earlier. Evidence that older testing techniques simply hadn't been able to analyze. In 2008, investigators used a newer method known as Y-STR DNA testing, which isolates male DNA on biological material collected during the original investigation. The testing focused on the evidence connected to one of the yogurt shop murder victims, and when the results came back, they raised serious questions about the convictions. The male DNA profile had not matched any of the 4 men who had been accused of the murders. That forced prosecutors to confront a difficult possibility that maybe, just maybe, the wrong people might have been convicted. This is what happens when we convict people purely on interrogations, forced confessions. Around the same time, appellate courts were also examining how the confessions had been used during the trials, and judges found a serious constitutional issue. During the separate trials, each defendant's confession had been used as evidence against the other, even though neither man had testified in court. That meant the defendants had been denied an opportunity to challenge the statements. That's a big fuck up, okay? The courts ruled that this violated the Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses. And as these legal issues started to pile up and the DNA evidence failed to link either of the men to the crime scene, the prosecution's case started to completely fall apart. It's disintegrating, right? There's nothing to grasp at anymore. And in 2009, prosecutors end up dropping the charges. The convictions are overturned. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott are released after spending nearly a decade in prison. How fucked up is that? With their release, the case returned to the same place it had been before the arrests. Unsolved. A cold case. The fucking roller coaster that these families were put on. Over the next several years, investigators continued working the case. Detectives revisited old evidence that had survived the fire. They ran new forensic tests as technology improved and compared DNA profiles against national databases, hoping for a match, but the progress was slow. Meanwhile, the victims' families continued pushing for answers. They kept the case in the public eye and they urged investigators not to give up on their girls. For more than a decade after Springsteen and Scott were released, the yogurt shop murders remained one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Austin's history. Eventually, advances in forensic science began producing new leads. Investigators were able to go back to the biological evidence that was collected during the original investigation. Using newer testing techniques, they were able to develop a clearer male DNA profile from material taken from one of the victims. And for years, that profile didn't match anyone in the databases that investigators had access to. But as DNA technology improved and the number of profiles in the national systems grew, detectives were able to compare that sample against a much larger pool of potential suspects. Those comparisons eventually pointed investigators towards a new suspect, Robert Eugene Brashers. Robert Brashers, he was a serial offender who had committed violent crimes in several states during the 1990s. Born in 1961, he had been linked to multiple sexual assaults and murders, crimes that involved both sexual violence and homicide. Investigators also revisited the ballistic evidence from the yogurt shop crime scene, and one of the shell casings recovered during the original investigation had been found in a drain inside the shop. And when analysts compared the markings on that casing to a firearm that had previously been associated with this Brashers guy, the patterns were consistent. Together, the DNA evidence and ballistic comparison created the strongest lead the case had seen in decades. But there was one problem. By the time investigators had made this connection, Robert Brashers was dead. Back in January of 1999, years before the new forensic testing was done, law enforcement officers had surrounded him during an investigation in Missouri. During the standoff that followed, he shot himself. But why? Well, turns out he knew that a life of crime had finally caught up to him. So let's talk about Robert Brashers. All right? We're going to sidetrack here a little bit. Robert had grown up primarily in Huntsville, Alabama, and unlike the FBI profile that they'd long searched for, he didn't match their ideal suspect. Remember that long list we had? Unkempt hair, drugs. Robert had never gotten into any trouble as a teenager, nor was he ever reported to be a heavy drinker or substance user, at least as a teenager. He graduated from high school, went off to the Navy for a few years, and eventually settled down in New Orleans, and in 1991, welcomed a daughter with his then girlfriend after relocating to Florida in the mid-80s. And that's actually where his career as a criminal began. Right there in Florida, in Port St. Lucie, to be exact. November 22nd, 1985, Robert meets this gal named Michelle Wilkerson. The two go to a bar together. Later on that evening, they're in an alleyway throwing back some beers in his car, Budweiser I read, when he tries to hit on her, and she's not having it. She tries to get out of the car. He ends up attacking her, and he shoots her twice, once in the neck, once in the head, and she fucking escapes, you guys. It manages to get away, hides under the road, ends up eventually getting up, going to a nearby apartment building, shot twice, lest we forget. They get her help. She fucking lives, and she tells the cops every single detail she can think of. She's a fucking badass, okay? Meanwhile, this loser had taken off after shooting her. He couldn't find her because she had taken off. He drives down to the beach, tosses the gun into the ocean, but minutes later, he's spotted by authorities and taken in, and is charged with attempted first-degree murder, aggravated battery, and using a firearm during the commission of a crime. And he is convicted of this crime, but he only serves 12 years. 12 years. And if that pisses you off, just wait, because on May 4th of 1989, he is released for good conduct. This man fucking shot a 24-year-old woman, tried to murder her, dispose of the evidence, and he's released after 4 years. Can you even fucking believe? Can you even believe? It gets worse. After his release, he goes on to commit 4 more murders at the Austin yogurt shop, sets it on fire, but that's not all. A few months after, in February of 1992, he's arrested for grand theft auto, and they find all this shit in his car, basically implying that he is pretending to be a police officer. He's got a police radio, a police jacket, a fake license. They arrested him. He pleads guilty in a plea deal and only goes to prison for 5 more years before being released in February of 1997. Are you fucking kidding me? It gets worse. The following year, he's arrested on April 12th of 1998 for breaking into a woman's home in Arkansas. He was armed. He had cut her phone line, but thank God he gets caught in the act and again arrested. But no problem, someone pays his bail and they let him out. It's unbelievable. A few months later, on November 7th of 1998, firefighters in Lexington, Kentucky are called to a structure fire. They get there, and after extinguishing the fire, they find the body of a 43-year-old woman named Linda Marie Rutledge, who had been shot in the head multiple times. Shot in the head, building set on fire. Still no connection was made. And this all came to an explosive ending on January 13th of 1999, when police are drawn to this car that was in the parking lot of a Super 8 motel in Kennett, Missouri. They run the plates on the car. Sure enough, it's stolen. They talk to the front desk, and the receptionist confirms that a man named Robert Brashers and his family had been in the room. Mind you, he has a whole ass family, right? The woman that he was with, the daughter they shared in 1991, and I believe the woman's 2 daughters from another relationship. His daughter that was born in 1991, I don't want to name her for her own privacy, but she did later on record say that he was incredibly abusive to her stepsisters, as well as their mom. So anyway, officers get confirmation that their suspect is in there. They break down the door of the motel. Robert pulls out a gun from under the bed. He threatens to kill himself. The officers back up, but the sirens are wailing, more cops are pulling up, the place is surrounded, and seeing no way out, Robert puts the gun to his head, pulls the trigger, and bam. But he doesn't die. He lives for 6 more days and eventually dies on January 19th of 1999, and I hope those days were excruciatingly painful for him. Because of that, investigators were never able to question him about the yogurt shop murders. Even so, the evidence linking him to the crime became the most compelling development the case had seen in more than 30 fucking years. As those findings came to light, attention also returned to the 4 men who had once been prosecutors for the murders. In February of 2026, a judge formally declared that Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn were innocent of the yogurt shop killings. Yes, they were already out, but that's a big deal. They need to be declared innocent. The ruling also acknowledged that the earlier prosecutions had been wrongful and that the evidence used to convict them had not been reliable. For the men who had spent years under suspicion and in some cases years in prison, the decision finally cleared their names. Even with a new suspect identified, however, important questions about the case remain unanswered to this day. Investigators still cannot say with certainty whether Robert Eugene Brashers acted alone or whether others may have been involved in the attack inside the yogurt shop on December 6th of 1991. There are also lingering questions about why he would have been in Austin that December, whether the murders might be connected to other unsolved crimes from that time period. More than 3 decades later, the yogurt shop murders remain one of the most disturbing crimes in Texas history. 4 young lives taken in a place that should have been safe, and a mystery that investigators spent a generation trying to solve. And that is where we're going to leave it for the week. I will see you next time, and until next time, if a violent man is behind bars, don't let him out. He'll steal a car. He's capable of violent crimes, and 5 whole years is not due time. That's right, a double rhyme, triple rhyme at that point. So that's it. That's the story of how this man literally got away with an onslaught of crimes before ever being caught. And it's situations like this. Sorry, I just need to rant a little more before I say goodbye to you guys. But it just pisses me off because I'm like, had he been actually held accountable for that first murder that he had committed or attempted murder that he had committed, when he shot that 24-year-old woman, he should have never been let out. And if he hadn't, those 4 girls from the Austin yogurt shop would be alive today. Another big old failure from the U.S. justice system. All right, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.